my friends, and today I'll be showing you how I painted and weathered this Fist of War German E-75 aus via Fubler Rheintakte R1 from, of course, Model Collect in 1/72 scale, as, of course, it comes with a nice instruction sheet with color choices, and funny enough, since as far as to my knowledge this thing never existed, some information about the specifications of like the crew and how many kilometers it could go, as you know, it obviously has spider walker legs, and I think it has very nice choices of color selection, as you may not have already seen obviously at the beginning of the intro of the finished model, that I would sort of be loosely following that first color choice that you saw there. The instructions actually went together quite well. I still maybe had some issues, maybe especially for beginners who might struggle with the legs, but overall I was able to overcome it and fix the issue of some minor gaps. But of course I used some additional plastic, like creating armor texture, adding on additional armor and other pieces from other models, especially from other model kit, and a fuel drum that you see on the side there, especially with some aluminum from aluminum cans. But now we can prime the model with this AK black primer, as we can now thin it with a couple drops of water to help keep the flow nice and smooth once we brush paint it on, to reduce any brush strokes. But luckily that this type of product self-levels and will nicely try and hide any of your mistakes, especially if you do accidentally overflow it on some other small details. Now we can begin painting it with our two main base colors. For the hull I use buff, and for the top turret I use German gray to give us a nice base coat color, as we'll be using sort of dry brush and overbrushing techniques that I will show you later on. And of course, for the outer armor legs, that you may already see, I have some additional rivets that I have not created for myself, but from a separate product that I happened to find and was lucky enough to have in my local hobby shop. But of course you can see that I use basalt gray to use it may seem actually lighter here, because number one, the paint is wet, it's lighter than when it actually is when it's dry, which of course will be darker, and will be much darker than what you see here, and eventually a more bluish cold tone, as you will later on see. But now I mix in about 85% intermediate green, 10% of desert yellow, and 5% of German gray that you saw there. Or you can mix in a small amount of black. But all I'm going for here is a sort of rich but not too vibrant kind of green that you may see on these splinter stripes, that the paint of course I don't have available, or it's out of your color choice, is that it's not always going to be a dark olive green color. Plus, also, it's my model. But now for the main highlights, I can use German gray mixed in with some white to help give us those overbrushing areas of any kind of method of, like you would do with a airbrush of post shading or adding those highlights of color modulation. But here, of course, it's not going to be perfect. It's just going to be a rough idea to help us get started on what areas will be dark or what areas will be light. As I told you earlier, I'll be using this blue-gray Hataka paint from their Hataka American aircraft paint set that I purchased, and it comes with nice dull gray colors and even some light gray colors, of course in a very good variety, but of course not for aircraft in this case, just mainly for weathering or other vehicles like in this case. Obviously using a dry brush method of using on the highlights of giving us a nice bluish tone, or I guess you could also just overbrush it to have that nice blue hue, as if your artistic style, of course. Now I can begin to show you my ultimate failure of using the tape, Tamiya tape specifically, which I do recommend, and you can use the sponge for our sharp splinter stripes with that AK Rosetta Green that I have from my late war German paint set that of course I used on my Tiger video, if you haven't seen that yet. And now you will see that I applied on way too much paint onto the sponge, and I do not recommend that, as you of course will have a ugly thick layer of paint despite it being already thinned, especially since it's tape and that it'll seep through the underlines despite it being well pressed on to the model. But just don't make the same stupid mistake I did of not removing the excess from the sponge so that you get a nice smooth even layer that doesn't clump up and look terrible. But of course we can fix that later on with a varnish or with a very soft sanding sponge. But also you can brush paint it, as you can see here, a nice thin layers, as a not perfect attempt, but since it's okay that it's a vehicle that never existed and it's I'm going for a late war what if German camouflage, especially for this fantasy tank. for the rocket, we're using light rust from Vallejo, of course, Panzer Aces, which, if you didn't know, is part of their magazine collection, and mahogany brown for a nice sort of off red oxide color. And as you can see there, I used a Vallejo acrylic polyurethane red brown primer, which of course in this case is way too dark for our liking. And of course we want it to make it look interesting and obviously lighter than what it actually is. So I think a best in case for this is to make the base coat lighter and then eventually tone it down with some reds and orange reds and maybe some more reddish rust colors that you may see me use later on. And of course mixing in some orange with that mahogany brown or just the light rust is in your case as well. But I will also show you how I created, or at least how you can create your own rust colors with just red, yellow, and maybe some brown to then eventually help you if you don't have any Vallejo specifically rust paints from one of the rust sets. For example, rust stain and streaking. But of course using flat red, yellow, and white as I told you earlier, but the white just for making it a little bit lighter, or I guess you could also use it for chipping. But as I show you here specifically with the droppers on my palette, I just mix it in to get a nice random rust color. Nothing really too specific, but as you can see in the later on, or at least from the intro of the finished model, that it will have a nice red hue to my liking. And of course this is entirely up to you if you want it more realistic or stylistic, with just any kind of colors that you may want with this rocket. Of course, it obviously doesn't even have to be a red bound color. But now, as you can obviously see, I'm using a sort of a moist overbrush technique, where the brush is wettened, but I'm just going over it and not specifically trying to fully cover the model, since obviously the rust colors that you saw me applying earlier, light rust and mahogany brown, are still relatively dark. And of course, making this lighter will help make the model pop even more, as I will also show that I have used a game wash black color, which is already pre-thinned, and even though it may say an ink wash, it really isn't. It's just an acrylic wash from Vallejo. But of course, even overbrushing here, no use of dry brushing, which I don't think is necessary, unless you want to do it on some of the raised areas and other rivets that you may see there. And of course, we're going to use some nice orange hues to it, which in my opinion, I think looks visually appealing and nice. A nice filter kind of wash of ochre brown, or I guess you could also use this completely straight orange of any, I guess, really any orange color that you may have laying around. If you don't have orange, of course, just mix yellow and red together to get a relatively nice vibrant orange of your liking. And of course, spreading it all over the rocket, making it look like a nice orange hue mess, basically. And of course, now for the black wash, which dries matte after drying, and I recommend that you shake well before use. And here, this would entirely change the model by toning it down, making it look dirty and a little bit grimy, as of course this spotter walker, actually, I intend for and imagine seeing it fighting in the streets of Berlin, or maybe out in the fields and the outskirts and the countryside. But now for khaki, white, chocolate brown, and Iraqi sand, I know that's a lot of colors, I mix them in together randomly here. So first on, it's Iraqi sand, since it's a nice light wood base color, and I then mix in together while it's drying with chocolate, and then with light streaks of khaki, and of course with some white to make them all look lighter, and for that nice wood grain effect that you may see there on the other side that I've already done. And then finally at the end for the wood grain highlights, which of course it looks very dark right now, I know, which I use mixed with white and khaki to get that nice light sort of edged effect that you would see on wood. And of course later on I will show you here in a second the Iraqi sand, sort of more focused of dry brushing, as I show you here on the hopefully some raised wood grain edges. As you constantly would have worked with the paint, it would have actually sort of created very subtle, as you may see there, wood grain effects that I didn't even add prior to painting this model. And of course, keeping the Iraqi sand paint in the center as our main highlight. Or you could push this even more by adding more white to Iraqi sand or khaki. All entirely up to your decision, of course. And even if you want the sort of relatively old but new wood color I'm going for here. And of course adding some maybe other stains, and as it's not completely fresh, of dark brown wash of my Tamiya paint that you saw me use earlier, or maybe with some chocolate brown. But now I will show you a very unusual way of getting metallic effects. So mixing together white and gloss varnish, as you can see there, and all in all, in all honesty, it kind of works but kind of doesn't. Yes, I do have a silver paint that I could have just painted on here, as I've got inspired from another model that someone has done similar to this thing's turret, but I'm using an AK silicone brush here mixed in with some graphite powder that you can just use grinding a piece of pencil on a piece of hard sanding paper. And yes, right there, it doesn't look the part as you may see in the thumbnail or on the beginning of the intro, but yeah, I probably should have just used maybe mixed in silver and black. But at some points of angle of light, it actually doesn't look too bad. So yeah, I will show you later on how in other ways you can use that same non-metallic effect. And of course you saw just a few seconds ago of mixing in a lot of flat yellow, or actually a very small amount of flat yellow with a lot of flat white, and giving us a nice fading effect on the model, giving us random variations of color, as of course it will all be toned down with our dark brown wash later on in the future, and of course future weathering like dust and some grime and maybe some dried mud carried on by the crew. But as you can see, we applied on the satin varnish to give us that very nice satin sheen, which personally I really love on my models, and you see that nice imperfection effect once you apply the ultra matte Tamiya flat wash, basically, or dark brown wash that's homemade with soap, and I've created it in my own little bottle in preparation for this. As I will show you that applying it on just after a few minutes, you can just remove it with just a cotton bud and water. And now for the additional armor panels that you see there, I'm creating a random texture with some sky gray and the base coat that you see there with a neutral gray, and then with some dark Prussian blue or any kind of other blue color that of your liking, and it helps give us a nice different color variation once we apply on the rust effects with light rust wash, and with, you can see here, a thinned down dark rust color to help give us again random interesting colors on the very rusted and additional armor piece that we can see here. Of course, it's entirely up to you if you want it fresh or very rusted, as to my liking here. And then, of course, what better way of creating very burned effects on the rear panel there for the launcher for the rocket, as if if it had already seen some use. And you can add on some nice light rust wash, some dark rust, maybe some flat brown, maybe some orange brown or ochre brown, and maybe possibly even just yellow. Any course of variation of color to then eventually add a very dark brown towards the center of the panel and maybe some black just for that very heavily burned stain that you would see on other, like for example, fireplaces or maybe some exhausts or just other areas that you would think that on vehicles that would have heavily burned stains, well, like as if something were to be burned, as like a burned out tank. But here it is very fun and relaxing to create burned effects, and I can't wait to do more in the future. And of course, obviously, we begin to mix in the buff and white color to give us those very nice light, fine beginning stages of chip effects on the model. I have multiple options here of using German camouflage black brown, dark rust, and chocolate brown, but of course it's all entirely up to your liking, as I will end up using black brown. But before I show you that chipping, I want to show you that I mixed in graphite powder within the cotton bud that you see here, just very nicely and gently rubbed on the edges of those bolts that you see there to get a very nice metallic look effect, which is exactly what I wanted to do on the rocket, but for some reason I just couldn't get it to be exact. Maybe it can, possibly, and hopefully be improved in the future. But of course, more sponge effects of chipping, and of course with light scratches, especially using a pencil on the raised areas of edges around the model, or exposed metal would be seen on the vehicle. But now we can use chocolate brown as a rusty chipping effect on the outer armor legs of the walker legs, as it looks very nice and appealing compared to with the other rust effects on the model. Further continuing or sort of medium rust effects, I use flat brown and mahogany brown for that nice reddish, especially when it's thinned down, reddish rust color hue that you would see on some rusted heavy metal parts. And I just think it looks just nice, and you could add more red, or again, orange, red, or yellow colors to change the rust effects that I showed you earlier. But I still wanted to keep it a sort of mild medium rust tone, as I will show you I apply on thin layers and some other thin streaks, as possibly counting as streaking grime as well. And for our final weathering effect, I mix together khaki and white in sort of equal parts to get our very nice light dust effect. And of course, going through some city streets and fighting. But thank you all so much for watching, as I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did in weathering and painting this sci-fi or fantasy tank, essentially. But today also happens to be my birthday, so yay! I'm happy to release this to you all as my gift to you. So I will see you all next time.